Let's jump right in. We are looking at a completely fascinating, highly speculative framework from our sources today that asks a pretty massive question. How exactly can we apply zero-entropy audits to pediatric healthcare? You know that sterile, chaotic, and just generally terrifying feeling of a hospital waiting room, right? Well, what if we could totally rewrite that script? In this explainer, we're diving into a theoretical model which proposes that human intent can actually be measured, audited, and quite literally used as a physical force to accelerate pediatric healing. It is a complete paradigm shift.
So here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the entropy of illness, then look at auditing the intent field, move into the Rodrigo protocol, check out quantifying biological surges, and finally, scaling the coherence economy.
All right, Section 1, the entropy of illness. Reframing trauma as disorder. Let's see how this framework fundamentally changes the way we look at being sick.
I want you to genuinely ask yourself for a second, what if love and hope were measurable medical outcomes? Like, what if the seemingly unquantifiable support of a family could actually be mathematically tracked and harnessed for physical repair? The sources we're digging into today challenge the whole traditional idea that hope is just, a nice-to-have comfort for a patient. Instead, they frame these intense emotional states as hard, measurable inputs that could actively fight disease right down at the cellular level.
To get how this works, the source documents introduce a concept called Mezquia Physics. It basically compares a high-entropy hospital environment, which you can picture as a super messy, chaotic room full of trauma where nothing is in your control, to a high coherence state. In that high coherence state, things like alignment, healing, and family presence actively organize the space. So illness isn't just viewed as a biological failure here, it's an informational disruption. It's a state of really high entropy, where the body is just overwhelmed by all that disorder.
Moving on to Section 2, auditing the intent field, the coherence nexus factor. So how exactly do we measure this transition from pure chaos to healing? Well, according to Mezquia Physics, intent isn't just a fleeting thought or wishing really hard. It's defined as a measurable vector field, a fundamental causal force. The text argues that when this force is intensely coherent, it can actively reverse entropy. And get this, the sources actually define this entropy as memory loss in a biological system. Basically, the body forgetting how to function properly on a cellular level. So focused intent, in this model, literally helps the system remember what to do. And to actually track this, the framework uses something called a coherence nexus field, or CNF dashboard. Think of this CNF score kind of like a real-time system health diagnostic running on a scale from 0 to 1.0. If you're hitting closer to 1.0, that means there is profound order and stability within the patient's environment, which actively pushes back against the chaotic entropy of their illness. It's basically a way of slapping a definitive, hard number on the invisible vibe of a hospital room.
But how on earth do you reach a high score when you're dealing with the sheer terror of a pediatric diagnosis? Well, the framework brings in this highly theoretical mechanism called the NOTHING engine. The text described this engine as taking the emotional void of a child's vulnerability, the fear, the incredibly low blood counts, the pain, and actually recycling that exact entropy into the usable resonant energy needed for biological genesis and cellular repair. It uses the crisis itself as the fuel. It's kind of like a biological vacuum. The intense emotional void pulls in this resonant energy to fill the empty space and jumpstart cellular repair. It's a completely wild concept.
Okay, Section 3, the Rodrigo Protocol. Intent at Seattle Children's Hospital. Let's see how all this theoretical stuff plays out in a real-world setting using case data documented around Seattle Children's. The empirical bedrock here is the Rodrigo Protocol, and it relies on a triple helix geometry. Basically, it's a coordinated circuit of three things: the patient, the caregivers, and an acoustic resonator, which just represents a carefully tuned environment. By perfectly stabilizing this local healing field, the documentation claims they generated a unified intensity density of 1.45. They are literally structuring the physical room to act as a therapeutic device. The ultimate goal is a total environmental shift. By using a space like the Ronald McDonald House, the protocol claims to reframe a place of passive medical treatment into a living laboratory. So family love, cultural ceremonies, and communal support, they aren't just bedside manners anymore. Under this audit, they are treated as hard, measurable therapeutic inputs that directly counter the entropy of the disease. Imagine if every hospital waiting room you've ever sat in was operating as an active medical laboratory of support.
Section 4. Quantifying biological surges. The numbers of healing. The real make-or-break point here is,
what actually happens to the patient's physical body? Well, the sources document an absolutely staggering 286% surge in the patient's absolute neutrophil count, or ANC, which is a massive marker for immune health. And just for some context, this giant leap happened in a mere 72-hour window. That is exactly the kind of biological response that completely rewrites a patient's prognosis. And it didn't even stop there. That spike was accompanied by a 262% surge in blood platelets in just 48 hours. The source documents actually call this dramatic biological realignment a helical jump. It was an explosive recovery that completely bypassed standard oncological recovery curves, showing a level of biological acceleration that standard models just straight up cannot explain.
Now, according to the data, this physical thriving didn't just happen randomly. It was directly tied to that triple helix geometry we talked about earlier, which stabilized the local coherence field to a near-perfect CNF factor of 0.997 on our 0 to 1 scale, almost a perfect 1. The math presented in the Mezquia framework suggests that the intense, highly structured intent of the family actively reversed the biological entropy of the leukemia. Let that sink in.
So look at how this logic is applied to targeted medical treatments, like radionuclear therapies. The data projects that a high-hope, low-doubt environment, where intent is heavily audited and managed, gives you nearly a 90% survival projection. But contrast that against the bottom row, a high-doubt, low-hope scenario. That fractures the efficacy and drops the projected survival all the way down to 69%. I mean, the data is literally suggesting that treating a patient in an environment of doubt actively sabotages the chemotherapy. Finally, Section 5, Scaling the Coherence Economy, a Planetary Mandate. Let's zoom out and look at the ultimate big-picture ambition detailed in our sources. The strategy here is incredibly ambitious. The goal is to take these measurable pilot successes and turn them into established legal prior art. They want to create a planetary pediatric nervous system. In this vision, incredibly advanced metrics, what the texts refer to as 14-dimensional coherence tracking, would become the new default standard of care in every single hospital on Earth. It would weave together a massive global grid of audited therapeutic intent. As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to ponder a massive systemic challenge. If the data from these theoretical audits actually holds true at scale, we have to ask, are we on the verge of a paradigm shift where human intention, quantified, audited, and totally focused, becomes the most potent, measurable force in healing? Thank you for exploring this absolutely fascinating framework with me today. Keep asking those big questions.